Kalorama, a recorded books/Highbridge imprint, presents The Fifth Horseman and the New Mad: How Massive Attacks of Disruption Became the Looming Existential Danger to a Divided Nation and the World at Large, by Harlan Ullman, read by Daniel Thomas May. When government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and establish a new one. The Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. A house divided among itself cannot stand. Abraham Lincoln, June 16, 1858. Then we fucked up the endgame. Charlie Wilson, from Charlie Wilson's War. Technological advances bring not only new possibilities to improve life, but also new problems and dangers. Vladimir Putin, December 1999. Charlie Wilson and Vladimir Putin were correct. Coronavirus and COVID-19 were the last warning. And indeed, we fucked up the endgame. It was massive disruption and not China or Russia or terror that did us in. It was us. Anne Jackson Bennett, President of the United States, 2029 to 2037. Author's note: Who will take notice? Who will act? Warnings, however prescient, too often go unheard and unheeded. As a young swift-boat skipper serving in Vietnam in mid-1967, I and two other Army and Marine officers were summoned back to the White House to brief President Lyndon Johnson on how we thought the war was going. In the pre-briefings, it was clear the President wanted to hear good news. He did not get it from me. I bluntly told him we were getting the shit kicked out of us and had two choices: get out or get in. We did neither at the time. A quarter of a century later, I found myself in profound disagreement along with more distinguished colleagues over the Clinton administration's decision to expand NATO without that leading to an eventual rift with Russia. It did. In 2002, I argued that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. The evidence came from many sources, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, the studies done for prior Central Command Commander Marine General Anthony Zinni, and access to foreign officials who discredited the alleged proof offered by the Iraqi general code-named Curveball of the existence of those weapons. We still invaded. During the Obama administration, I tried to change the thrust of its first major security review called the Afghanistan-Pakistan Study to focus on the real center of gravity, Pakistan. That, too, failed. When President Obama chose to use the right to protect to lead from behind in attacking Libya to save Benghazi from a threat that did not exist, I protested. But no one listened. My critique of the Trump administration extended to at least 50 columns and articles. Those, too, had little impact. Today, a deeply disunited United States faces perhaps the greatest set of crises in its history, extending far beyond the coronavirus/COVID-19 and the death, disruption, and dislocation wrought by the pandemic. In an intractably politically divided nation, the Constitution and the American way of life are at grave risk to supercharged forces that have emerged in what I term the era of the new mad: massive attacks of disruption. Disruptions have always had great and often massive impact. The reason why today is profoundly different from the past is because in an age of globalization and the diffusion of power, states, governments, and people have become uniquely vulnerable to disruption, whether from man or nature. Unlike the Cold War's mad, mutual assured destruction and the threat of thermonuclear annihilation, many of the new mad's disruptors are not deterrable, and if deferred, may not be preventable. But who is taking notice? And who is taking action? So far, the answer is no one. The purpose of this book is to persuade the American public to do both. If not, the conditions Ann Jackson Bennett faced as president in 2029 could come to pass. Despite my dismal track record, I hope that this time these warnings will take hold. Harlan Ullman, Washington, D.C., June 1, 2021. Author's Guide for the Listener. The central argument of this book is that a new, more virulent version of the Cold War's MAD, mutual assured destruction and thermonuclear Armageddon, is a specter haunting the world at large. It is the specter of a new MAD for massive attacks of disruption that is a looming existential danger confronting mankind. The first draft was completed in late 2020, a year before the book was published. During this interregnum, the proof and evidence of the presence and power of this new MAD could not be overstated. The arrival in early 2020 of the coronavirus/COVID-19, followed by the SolarWinds cyber attacks, presumably from Russian sources, against the U.S. government later that year, and then the shutdown of the colonial pipeline that supplied the bulk of gasoline to the U.S. East Coast in spring 2021. The unprecedented January 6, 2021 insurrection and the storming of the Capitol building, America's cathedral of democracy, and the subsequent unrest accompanying the inauguration of Joe Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president 2 weeks later, based on the big lie of a stolen election, were stunning and shocking harbingers of the presence and power of this new MAD. And I expect that in the time between the completion of the final editing of the book and its publication, even more evidence and proof of the power of MAD will be further shocks to the system, for good or ill, such as those arising from the chaotic evacuation of non-combatants taking place in late August 2021, as many tens of thousands fled to Kabul airport in hopes of obtaining safe passage out of Afghanistan. Chapter 1 describes how a confluence of unprecedented forces has created a Fifth Horseman of the apocalypse, armed with the new and unique massive attacks of disruption. Chapter 2 poses scenarios of how the new MAD and its 7 main disruptors threaten both the United States and world at large by targeting political, economic, cultural, and societal vulnerabilities, including, for the first time since 1861, the Constitution. Many inadvertently and ironically created by the benefits of globalization and the diffusion of power. Chapters 3 through 5 critically examine from a contrarian perspective how Russia and China perceive the domestic and international environments and conditions of what will later be described as a post-Westphalian world. Chapter 6 compares the 1918 to 1920 Spanish flu and the 2020 coronavirus/COVID-19 pandemics. Chapter 7 provides case studies of profound transformative inflection points, perhaps similar to the arrival of MAD, before and after 2 world wars, the end of the Cold War, and September 11. These are reminders of past failures and successes that can serve as future guides if leaders choose to listen. Based on analyses of the strengths, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses of the U.S. Constitution, Congress, and the executive branch under the threat of MAD, Chapters 8, 9, and 10 offer organizational and policy recommendations for government and for new national security, defense, and foreign policy strategies to corral and contain the Fifth Horseman and MAD. If undertaken, perhaps one fundamental paradox of the past 60 years can be reversed. The U.S. military has won virtually every battle it fought, but the U.S. still lost all the wars it started. To empower a national economic recovery, a national investment fund was proposed. The Biden administration's COVID relief bill was passed by Congress and signed into law. But the bills for jobs, families, and infrastructure faced heavy congressional opposition. This proposed fund, named the 1923 Fund for the greatest economic boom in American history following the 1918 to 1920 pandemic, remains a viable alternative for several compelling reasons described in later sections. The book's endnote issues a final warning. If the dangers and threats posed by MAD and its 7 major disruptors to the nation, the Constitution, the American dream, and our way of life are ignored, dismissed, or underestimated, then the dire conditions described in the preface will prove altogether too prescient. But who will listen? And who will lead? Preface. State of the World, 2029. Noon, January 20, 2029. An undisclosed location. President Anne Jackson Bennett took the oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, becoming America's 48th chief executive. She faced a country ravaged by multiple crises, many arising from routine shortages of the most basic human needs for food, water, medicine, and electricity. The nation's condition was worse than at any time in its history. From the depths of the Civil War, the Great Depression, the early days of World War II, the Vietnam War, and September 11 to the arrival of coronavirus/COVID-19 9 years before. Because of its massive federal debt, the country was unable to pay its bills. Superstorms, tornadoes, floods, and droughts crippled the already obsolete national power grid, denying millions of Americans access to electricity for extended periods of time measured in weeks, not days. Extreme weather brought havoc to the agricultural and farming sectors. Access to the internet and cell phone service was regularly disrupted because of the antiquated state of the nation's infrastructure. Riots and protests over shortages of basic goods that governments at the federal, state, and local levels were unable to provide kept police forces and National Guard units occupied on a near-permanent basis. Only 100 million Americans voted in November 2028 because of restrictions on movement, difficulties in obtaining absentee ballots due to domestic unrest, and coronavirus/COVID-28 forcing massive stay-at-home orders. The election of President Joe Biden in 2020 had the potential to reverse many of the catastrophic mistakes and misjudgments of the prior administration. But vitriolic partisanship intervened with the occupation of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and riots 2 weeks later during the inauguration, in part over the second impeachment of Donald Trump, cut the political honeymoon short on January 21, 2021. Biden called for a national revival based on several pieces of legislation. The relief, jobs, and family bills totaling $6 trillion to promote each, and new technologies for health care, climate change, and the environment, and for major rejuvenation of the nation's infrastructure. These were the most transformational proposals since FDR's New Deal. But Republicans and Democrats in Congress could not agree. The massive proposed debt increases were worthy of a full debate. However, political expediency and political scorched earth policies to manipulate the forthcoming 2022 elections to advantage, and litigating or forgetting or forgiving the role of former President Donald Trump in inciting the January 6, 2021 insurgents, overrode principle and acting in the nation's and not the party's best interest. Full funding was never approved. Biden was not re-elected, nor was his successor, and the nation continued to suffer over the failure of its government to govern. Despite the widespread euphoria over the approval of COVID vaccines in late 2020 and early 2021, the vaccination process took longer than anticipated because of failure of the earlier administration to plan for distribution and large numbers of anti-vaxxers who refused inoculation. With the spread of COVID 2028 8 years later, hackers attacked the vaccine refrigerator distribution systems required to store the drugs at -94 degrees Fahrenheit, ruining millions of doses and derailing the inoculation process for months. The hackers were never identified nor brought to justice, even though these actions probably led to hundreds of thousands of unnecessary COVID deaths. Millions of Americans still refused to be vaccinated, preventing a quick end to the new pandemic. Delays may have caused COVID to mutate, becoming even deadlier and spreading beyond humans. What happened with the COVID transmission to Denmark's mink population in late 2020 erupted elsewhere. Livestock, crops, plants, and trees were infected in this second viral pandemic, inducing even greater food shortages. Climate change generated more intense and destructive storms, accelerating the melting of polar ice caps. With the unexpected rise in sea levels, hundreds of thousands of Americans fled the coasts to safer regions. Mexico and Canada closed their borders with the United States to prevent this exodus from spilling over into both nations. Cybercrimes exceeded all murders, robberies, muggings, rapes, and sales of illicit substances combined. Social media was the vehicle for organizing often daily protests and riots by the legions of unemployed, hungry, scared, and desperate citizens. In increasing numbers, radical and extremist groups employed terror to disrupt and destroy with cyber, social media, modern weapons, and drones. An anarchist group calling itself DAN, for Destroy America Now, and modeled after the radical organizations that seized the Capitol building back in January 2021, had simultaneously struck the White House, Capitol, and other government buildings with hundreds of drones carrying explosives. The new White House, moved to a secure location, was literally a concrete iceberg with virtually the entire interior buried deeply below ground. Congress had transferred to the safety of Fort Leslie J. McNair at the southern tip of Washington, D.C., at the junction of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. But the greatest challenge facing the president and the nation was the inability to govern under the Constitution of the United States. Could the constitutional checks and balances still work with intractable divisions between two intractably polarized and partisan political parties without any means of reconciliation? Abroad, China was dominant. The great power competition put the United States and China on a collision course that was far more damaging to America than to China. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, signed in 2020 among 15 Asian states, including many of America's allies, began this road to Chinese supremacy, followed by the new trade agreement renegotiated with the European Union in 2022. Although 250 million Chinese died in the years after a more virulent form of the coronavirus hit, China's economy eventually surpassed America's. The coronavirus attack dispelled the theory that China had developed the virus as a weapon to use against the West, or had engineered it to infect non-Chinese. The majority of deaths were among the poorest Chinese. The impact, ironically, reduced pressure on China's economy for double-digit annual growth to raise standards of living, strengthening the control and power of the ruling Communist Party. With RCEP in place, Asian states turned away from the U.S. and joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. America became even more dependent on the Chinese supply chain. Taiwan was absorbed into the mainland, and one China was finally achieved as the U.S. Navy was incapable of breaking the embargo placed around the island by the Chinese maritime militia and fishing fleets. China's technology continued to outstrip America's. And, perhaps most humiliating for America, the renminbi replaced the dollar as the global reserve currency. North Korea's Kim Jong-un was assassinated in 2025. Over the next 3 years, North Korea moved closer to China. Just as Hong Kong was assimilated into China in 2020, North Korea became a de facto Chinese province. Vladimir Putin celebrated his 77th birthday in Kiev in 2029 following what Moscow termed as Ukraine's reaccession to Russia that was a de facto annexation. The Trump decision in 2020 to withdraw a substantial troop presence from Germany sent NATO into decline. By 2029, it was in disarray. Hungary had formally seceded from the alliance. France withdrew from NATO's military committee, repeating Charles de Gaulle's action 60 years before, as did Turkey in 2024. NATO was hardly a debating society and no longer a serious military alliance. In the Persian Gulf, the U.S. policy of maximum pressure and the failure to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, that would have prevented Iran from obtaining a nuclear capability, gave Tehran the reason and excuse to develop nuclear weapons. In 2029, American intelligence estimated Iran possessed at least 100 nuclear warheads, a substantial number carried by hypersonic missiles bought from China. With Iraq and Syria as surrogates and Shia-dominated Bahrain, an Iranian ally, Saudi Arabia was forced to defer to Tehran. Iran became the regional superpower. Its reach extended to Israel. Facing annihilation, Israel had no choice except to return the West Bank to Jordan and the Golan Heights to Syria. That transfer coincided with the release from prison of a third former Israeli prime minister convicted of bribery, extortion, and perjury. In her abbreviated inaugural address, the new president rephrased the Kennedy theme of "Do not ask what your country can do for you." Instead, she asked, "The question is not how we got here or even how we will extricate ourselves. The question is, can we unify a disunited United States?" Of course, these scenarios sound wildly implausible. But on New Year's Day 2020, was a global pandemic, subsequent widespread protests over the murder of a black American that would lead to a racial reckoning, or the only sacking of the Capitol since the British attack in 1814 on anyone's mind? Yes, it can happen here. Chapter 1. The Fifth Horseman, Mad, and a disunited 51% nation called the United States. A house divided cannot stand, especially when political termites are at work. Make no mistake, the arrival of the coronavirus/COVID-19 pandemic was not only a once-in-a-century event. Yes, the pandemic metastasized into a massive international crisis and personal tragedies for many hundreds of millions, if not billions, of global residents who were infected, died, or whose lives were fundamentally disrupted by the virus. But the pandemic was the precursor of profound and even greater tectonic changes that so far have not been fully recognized or understood by governments and the public. Powerful and invisible forces had arisen to challenge and threaten the safety, security, health, and prosperity of American society at large beyond what has become the great power competition with China and Russia. These forces combined the most potentially disruptive, destructive, and insidious challenges, threats, and dangers to the nation since the Civil War, taking the form of a fifth horseman of the apocalypse, armed with a new mad. This was not the Cold War's mutual assured destruction that threatened thermonuclear war. This new mad is massive attacks of disruption. And as with viruses, the new mad does not respect borders or boundaries, nor does it distinguish between domestic and international politics. The Fifth Horseman and mad were inadvertent and dangerous byproducts of the diffusion of power and globalization. Two consequences are of greatest significance. By the first decade of this century, the combination of the diffusion of power and globalization unraveled the old state-centric Westphalian system. The notion that countries exercised exclusive sovereignty over their own territories and were the ultimate legitimate users of force that had dominated international politics for 350 years. The centrality of states has been displaced and in part replaced in importance by this horseman and the new mad. The second and more dire consequence arose from the central paradox of the new mad era. During the final decades of Westphalia, standards of living greatly improved for most citizens around the world. Ironically, however, in this process, greater vulnerability and fragility to all forms of disruption were created by both man and nature. Worse, for the United States, as mad was taking hold, political divisions had not been as intractable possibly since 1860. How America became so disunited is part of this story. And this extreme divisiveness has created its own unique vulnerability that exposed potential flaws and weaknesses in the Constitution and the system of checks and balances to disruption, further crippling the ability of the government to govern. It is this unprecedented vulnerability and viability of the Constitution that may prove the most daunting challenge to American democracy in a century and a half. Beyond sounding this dire warning about the gravity of these conditions, the purposes of this book are threefold. The first is to tell the story and the history of how a fifth horseman of the apocalypse, armed with the new MAD, displaced the Cold War's MAD as the organizing strategic paradigm for national security. Second is to demonstrate how and why the new MAD and its 7 major disruptors differ in magnitude from past disruptions and pose potentially existential challenges, dangers, and threats at least as great or greater than those of traditional state and non-state actors because of the MAD paradox. As societies advanced and standards of living increased due to globalization, vulnerabilities and fragilities multiplied geometrically. Third, and most importantly, are the recommendations for necessary changes to the organization, policies, and strategies of the U.S. government to fulfill the aspirations of the preamble to the Constitution, to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity in a MAD-driven age. One engine empowering these reforms and recommendations is this book's argument for a national private-public investment fund of up to $3 trillion. The fund, if approved, would support investments in healthcare, the environment and climate change, high-technology areas from artificial intelligence to genome research, and the nation's failing infrastructure. The Biden administration has proposed a different approach in the form of 3 bills totaling $6 trillion that do not include public-private partnerships. Full approval by Congress of the Jobs and Families bills will not occur. Hence, at some time in the future after this book is published, the necessity for a national investment fund should resurface. The United States has, over the past decades, become a 51% nation, divided almost equally over virtually every issue and thus fractured and disunited. That has made America and Americans extraordinarily more susceptible to all forms of disruption because its government and political systems are increasingly unable to respond to extraordinary stress and make difficult unifying decisions. To compound and complicate the dangers of MAD, historically American presidents too often failed to exercise appropriate strategic thought, judgment, and empathy in domestic and foreign policy decision-making. Adequate knowledge and understanding of conditions and situations were not always sought, or were ignored and dismissed before decisions were made. Examples of these failures follow. Whether embarking on military interventions and adventures for the wrong reasons, such as in Vietnam or the Second Iraq War, or diminishing or dismissing crises such as the virulence of pandemics in 1918 to 1920 and 2020, as 2 presidents have, bad outcomes were assured. These failures are likely to be made worse in a MAD-driven information age. A principal reason, as will be argued, is that not only are knowledge and understanding often lacking in decision-making, but truth and fact are now missing in action as well in a 51% divided nation. These continuing failures are manifested in the current great power competition with China and Russia, a competition that will prove unsustainable, unaffordable, and unexecutable. The military aims of the U.S. National Defense Strategy of 2018, NDS, and continued by the Biden administration are to compete, deter, and, if war comes, defeat China or Russia or North Korea or Iran and violent extremism. Nowhere, however, are compete, deter, and defeat defined. No operational concepts and plans yet exist to achieve these ends. No off-ramp exists to prevent a future confrontation or conflict, nor is any timescale offered as to whether or not this competition has an end date and how that might be determined. As the Cold War's mutual assured destruction was an outgrowth of the specter of thermonuclear war and societal annihilation, the new MAD is a product of 7 current major disruptive forces. The first 2 are potentially the most dangerous: failed and failing government and climate change. The remaining disruptors, cyber, social media, drones, terrorism, and debt, should not be underestimated in the damage and dislocation each can cause. MAD and these disruptors target societal vulnerabilities and fragilities. Chapter 2 presents how each of the disruptors can impose great damage, disarray, and destruction in detailed scenarios drawn from actual events carrying on from the world of 2029 described in the preface. Surprisingly, MAD has a beneficial side. The industrial and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?